No federal regulation applies if it stays in Tennessee. Now, if it crosses state lines, they're going to use the Commerce Clause to regulate that. But if the firearm stays in Tennessee or Montana or these other 6 states, then that whatever federal regulation they decide to pass does not apply. That is a state right. In the 18 enumerated powers for Congress, it says nothing about regulating guns within the state, or anything within the state for that matter. Another thing that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because the state doesn't have the power to regulate firearms. Nobody does.
State. No. But the state, on the state level, the state can pass their own laws, and the states are not passing laws where you can't have a gun. They're passing laws that say that the federal government has no jurisdiction in my state with regards to guns, that all the parts are made in my state and stay in my state. And that's what they're passing. And they're passing legislation now with the passage of the health care fiasco legislation. They're passing laws that are similar to that with regards to health care. You know, they're introducing laws that say we are opting out of this and you can't stop us from doing it because this is state regulated, and you can't use the Commerce Clause to say Missouri or Tennessee or Kansas or Arkansas is going to pay for regulations that the federal government deems necessary because the federal government wants them to do it. That's not the way it's done. The states decide, and then the representatives from the states go to Washington, D.C., and they decide whether it's good or bad. But they cannot use this Commerce Clause to do business in states. They can use it to do business across states, but not in states. And so they cannot force Missouri. If Missouri passes a law, and I'm going to use Missouri since I live here, and they've introduced the law already, if they pass a law that says Missouri citizens do not have to participate in the federal health legislation, then that law applies first, because the states have the right to do that. It doesn't say anything in the enumerated powers of Congress that Congress has the right to pass legislation that says that everyone in the state of the United States of America, in the country of the United States of America, has to buy health care. That is not one of their enumerated powers. I'll tell you what is, though, the coining of money. They gave that up to private bankers. And look what happened to that.
Yep.
So,
well, hey, that's another thing. What are the suggestions that you might have for the people who want to get out of the control of the Federal Reserve, to get off of the fiat currency?
Well, Edwin Vieira wrote a piece of legislation in New Hampshire that would that said that the New Hampshire Treasury would have to keep a certain portion of their funds in gold or gold and silver. And so what the idea was is that they would pay on first come, first served the contracts that the state had to pay out in gold or silver first, to whoever wanted that. And the idea was that more and more people would want to be paid in gold and silver, and so that the state of New Hampshire would have to keep more of its budget in gold and silver, and eventually work out of the Federal Reserve System altogether and be on a gold and silver standard. And it would become so popular that even the private citizens would want to be paid in gold and silver. And at that point, and he states this in the film, Don't Tread on Me, at that point, the Federal Reserve notes would be like a foreign currency, and you'd have no need to accept them unless you did business out of the state. And then other states would say, oh, look at New Hampshire. They've actually got money that's worth something. They're trading in gold and silver. We want to do the same thing. We want to have value to our money. And so they would do that. Unfortunately, the legislation did fail in New Hampshire, but 6 other states have picked up variations of it, and they're working with it to see if they can do something with it.
Do you know why it did fail?
I do not know that. Yeah, that's something that I am very interested in finding out. I'd like to speak to him again about that and see if I can find out anything about it. But You know, it is one of those interesting things. Why would they not want to do that? Because it would get them out of a worthless monetary system completely.
Well, the government has more or less become the mafia boss to the states. I mean, if they don't implement the federal government's little packages and stuff, like taxation and without representation and stuff, then they take away from the schools. They take school funding away. They started giving funding, and the schools started growing. And of course, if you're giving money, you're going to buy a bigger school. You're going to build a better
exactly.
place. You're going to buy better specialized equipment. And then all of a sudden, the government says, well, you don't play ball with us. We're pulling the rug out from under your school system. And
exactly.
Federal money for roads, federal money for infrastructure. We give tax breaks to large corporations, and we let them have free electricity. Boeing, which was here for decades, has they received free electricity until they built their own substations. And
isn't that crazy?
Yeah, and we're so dependent now upon that fiat currency that I understand a little bit of the difficulty in states and having to pull away from that. But it's just like we, the people, we have to make that happen.
Exactly.
That program, the first thing that I would cut if I was a state official would be my salary and every senator, and congressman from my state would have to start selling their ranch houses and their vacations.
Yeah.
That's
exactly.
where I start cutting.
Well, I'll tell you something too. When you're talking about the way that the federal government holds states hostage, Representative Charles Key in Oklahoma introduced what he calls the federal tax escrow account, and they talk about that in the film Don't Tread on Me too. But basically what that means is that on the state level, they're going to collect your federal income tax. And of course, you have a little bit of a disconnect there, because there are a lot of people that feel like the federal income tax is illegal. So you'd have to deal with that, at some point. But this is what we have now, and this is what he's proposing now that would make a difference now. You know what I mean? And
right.
So what he is talking about is, on the state level, the treasurer will collect the federal income tax, and if the federal government passes something that demands money from the states to implement, the states would keep the federal income tax and pay that bill, and then would pay the federal government what is constitutionally based that they should get. So that when the federal government says, oh, you're going to do such and such, say schools, we're going to give you so much money for schools. Well, they make sure they get so much money for schools and send the rest of the federal government to run the government. Which is quite a novel idea. And what's funny about that is, too, that Kansas, Georgia, and Washington state are now introducing similar legislation. And can you imagine if that catches on, all the state governments are going to collect the federal income tax, and they're going to have to wait for their money.
Right. Well, if they're in Louisiana, they probably won't ever get
it. Yeah, that's true too, actually. That's true too.
I read an article not long ago about the Gulf oil victims were complaining, and there was a study came out that said that none of the judges that were sitting in the state of Louisiana were able to handle any oil cases because they all had conflicting interests.
Imagine that.
There's federal judges included in that, don't you know?
Oh, of course.
And that's
absolutely.
The states have to clean house. We have to start from the community level all the way up through the states.
Exactly, and that's where your change is going to begin, on the state of the very local community level, and it's going to filter upwards.
That's where the people have their power.